Hello everyone, welcome back. I am Kris. This is part 2, Peninsula campaign. Why the American Civil War wasn't won quickly. Civil War wasn't. I had to stop. Okay, before we get started, click that thumbs up for me, subscribe to the channel, and you can donate through the thanks button. If you request a video after you've donated, your name's sponsoring that video. You can still request without donating. You don't have to request anything if you donate. It's strictly up to you. It's strictly up to you. That's what I meant to say. All right. I'm going to snack on some veggies. So let's get into the video.
Valley. Richmond could not withstand a siege. However, Johnson realized that McClellan, bedridden with malaria, was more interested in establishing supply bases than advancing. He'd left 1/3 of his army south of the Chickahominy in exposed positions, and Johnson intended to capitalize. A.P. Hill and Magruder's divisions would launch diversions on the north bank, while James Longstreet led 51,000 men to attack the 30,000 Federals on the south bank from 3 directions, overwhelming and destroying them. However, Davis's earlier meddling bore fruit. Longstreet either misunderstood his verbal orders or changed them without telling Johnson. Other written orders were either lost or vague, and many officers didn't know or ignored that Longstreet was in command of the operation. Consequently, the plan fell apart before it began. The attack began at 0800 on May 31st, but Longstreet took the wrong road, delaying his attack for hours. The assault force was waiting for Longstreet to initiate the battle, and so they just stood around waiting. At 1300, an impatient D.H. Hill finally attacked the Union's far left flank near Fair Oaks Station alone. Acoustic shadows meant neither commanding general heard the battle commence. This initial wave of 10,000 rebels smashed through Union skirmishers only to be halted at the breastworks. Brigadier General Silas Casey sent out desperate pleas for reinforcements, but they were slow to arrive, and Casey's division was overwhelmed as more rebels joined the attack piecemeal. By 1430, the Union troops fell back to redoubts near Seven Pines. McClellan had still received no reports of action. Johnson was out looking for the attack force, but thanks to the acoustic shadows, he still heard nothing. Here, the battle stabilized as individual Union officers marched to the sound of the guns, directed by balloon observations. It wasn't until 1600 that Johnson learned what was happening, after Longstreet asked permission to join the battle he was supposed to be leading. Despite the additional Confederate pressure, overwhelming Union numbers began to tell, and a counterattack began, during which Johnson received a bullet wound in the arm and shrapnel to the chest while riding forward to organize the chaos. McClellan never took control of the battle. The battle petered out as night fell. During the night, individual Union regiments attempted night attacks, only to find that many Confederate units had left their positions. Fighting resumed the next morning along the line, but accomplished nothing, and the Confederates retreated by noon, having suffered 6,100 casualties and inflicted 5,400. After Seven Pines, McClellan abandoned any remaining offensive pretense. Seeing his beloved soldiers become casualties completely gutted him. He refused to move until his siege guns, delayed by heavy spring rain, arrived, and he could bombard the rebels out of Richmond. Meanwhile, Robert E. Lee, Davis's military advisor, took command from the incapacitated Johnson. Realizing McClellan's intentions, Lee used the reprieve to recall Jackson from the valley, plan his response, and reorganize Johnson's Department of Virginia into the Army of Northern Virginia. He couldn't directly counter McClellan's siege guns, so he'd use boldness instead. First, Johnson and now Lee had realized that McClellan's public bravado was hollow. Thus, while they might not be able to fight him away, they could certainly intimidate him away from Richmond. Needing more information, Lee dispatched cavalry under Jeb Stuart to reconnoiter the Federal right. Stuart rode 100 miles in 3 days, completely circling the Union Army and reporting that following Seven Pines, the Union Army had redeployed south of the Chickahominy. Only the 5th Corps remained above it, and it and the supply line to White House Landing on the right flank were exposed. Therefore, Lee gambled that McClellan wouldn't attack again, and he could destroy the exposed Union right by concentrating most of his army against one Union corps. He planned for Jackson's Valley veterans to seize White House Landing, while Magruder's division demonstrated on the Union left. The rest of the army would overwhelm the exposed Union troops. The attack was scheduled for June 26th. However, McClellan realized the risk and abandoned White House Landing for Harrison Landing. On June 25th, McClellan finally advanced on Oak Grove to secure positions for his siege guns. At 0800, 3 brigades moved towards the high ground. While the center and left brigades successfully pushed through the rebel defenses, Sickles' brigade on the right fell behind, opening a window for a successful counterattack which temporarily halted the advance until reinforcements arrived. McClellan, managing the battle via telegraph from 3 miles away, panicked and ordered a withdrawal at 10:30 so he could rescue the situation in person. He arrived at 1200, realized that they'd been winning the battle until he meddled, and sent his troops forward again at 1300. By nightfall, they'd retaken their objectives. This was the closest the Federal Army came to taking Richmond until 1864. The next morning, Jackson was supposed to initiate the attack on the Union right flank, near Mechanicsville, with AP and D.H. Hill supporting him once he engaged. However, that attack never came. During the Valley Campaign, his soldiers had earned a reputation as foot cavalry for their rapid advances and maneuvers, allowing Jackson to execute one of the greatest defeat-in-detail campaigns in military history. However, they'd been force marching for nearly 5 months and were utterly exhausted. Jackson was in equally poor shape. Consequently, he moved too slowly and never engaged. Instead, AP Hill grew impatient waiting for Jackson and attacked towards Mechanicsville at 1500. The Union division in town quickly fell back to prepared defenses behind Beaver Dam Creek and easily repelled the attack with massed artillery. Lee arrived, realized the situation, and sent Longstreet and D.H. Hill forward to support the attack. Union reinforcements stabilized the front, and darkness ended the fighting. Jackson did eventually arrive as the fighting wound down and made camp instead. Lee gained nothing but 1,484 casualties, inflicting just 361. That night, Major General Fitzjohn Porter realized that the 5th Corps' flank was exposed and shifted to better positions along Boatswain's Swamp near Gaines Mill. Despite calls from his generals to attack Magruder's exposed position with overwhelming force, which would have easily broken through, McClellan refused. In his mind, Magruder's force alone outnumbered the Army of the Potomac, which was in danger of being surrounded. On June 27th, Lee again concentrated 57,000 men against the 5th Corps, unaware it had redeployed. The plan was essentially the same as the previous day. While AP Hill and Longstreet attacked and pinned the left flank, Jackson and D.H. Hill would circle around the Union's exposed right flank and attack from the rear. Again, Jackson was late. D.H. Hill advanced to Old Cold Harbor at 1300, expecting to link up with Jackson, but instead found Union defenses. Realizing that the flank had moved, he fell back. Acoustic shadows kept Lee ignorant of this development. Meanwhile, AP Hill's advance across Beaver Dam Creek encountered nothing but skirmishers until finding Porter's primary defenses along Boatswain's Swamp. The swamp and Union reinforcements stifled the attack. Meanwhile, McClellan became convinced that the right was lost and began to prepare a full retreat. Jackson's lead division reached the field at 1530 and was ordered to support Longstreet's diversionary attack to rescue Hill, which succeeded with heavy casualties. Despite calls for a counterattack, McClellan refused to move from defensive positions. Jackson himself finally arrived at 1900, having gotten lost on the wrong road. After finally linking up with D.H. Hill, they assaulted the Union left, while Longstreet and Hill again attacked the right, first piecemeal, then in large waves. At dusk, Porter's line was broken, but he retreated across the Chickahominy under cover of night, burning all the bridges behind him. McClellan's last nerve shattered. Magruder's reconnaissance in force on the 27th confirmed, in only his mind, that he was surrounded and was about to be attacked on all sides by a superior force, and he panicked. McClellan ordered a full retreat to Harrison's Landing and the safety of Union gunboats, telegraphing Secretary of War Edwin Stanton, "If I save this army now, I tell you plainly that I owe no thanks to you or any other persons in Washington. You have done..."
I just want to say what a great name, Edwin Stanton.
"Your best to sacrifice this army," though the Signal Office didn't pass on the last part. Lee intended to attack again to cut the Federal retreat, but didn't know where McClellan was headed until close to nightfall. McClellan's logistical genius was in full effect as he maneuvered the baggage train south through the choke points in White Oak Swamp on the 28th. Once the supplies were clear, McClellan left for Harrison's Landing without designating a second-in-command and played no further part in the campaign beyond sending Porter ahead to establish a defensive position on Malvern Hill. The army regrouped around Savage's Station, its main supply base, while the corps commanders worked out the retreat. Union morale plummeted once they realized that the burning supplies meant they were retreating, and many wounded had to be left behind. Meanwhile, Lee smelled blood and was determined to pursue and destroy the Federal army completely. Jackson was to rebuild a Chickahominy bridge, link up with Magruder, and launch a powerful enough attack on the rearguard to make the Federals turn and fight long enough for the rest of his army to circle around and block the road. Skirmishing began around 0900, but tapered off around 1100 as Union forces pushed back the Confederates and gradually withdrew. Jackson thought he had to rebuild all the bridges, and a garbled attack order came across as orders to guard the crossings, so he didn't engage. Magruder, hesitant and outnumbered, failed to attack until 1700. The fighting around Savage's Station devolved into an artillery duel accompanying scattered attacks and counterattacks, with the only notable occurrence being the Land Merrimac, a Confederate armored train, bombarding the Union position. The Union withdrew to positions strung out between White Oak Swamp and Glendale that night. Lee realized this was his last chance to destroy the Union army, and again resolved to attack with his whole army. A.P. Hill and Longstreet would attack the Federal left to cut off their escape, while Jackson turned the right in a double envelopment. However, Jackson never made it across White Oak Swamp. On the verge of mental and physical collapse, and finding the main bridge destroyed, he milled about on the north side rather than find an alternative route through the swamp. He finally ordered an artillery bombardment at 1400, then fell asleep under a tree until 1600. Longstreet and Hill waited for Jackson's attack until 1600, when Union artillery forced them to attack. They successfully pierced the Union's line, but were thrown back by brutal counterattacks. Again, darkness ended the inconclusive, bloody fighting. During the night, the Federals completed their retreat to Malvern Hill, where Porter had cleared sightlines for the 250 cannons supporting breastworks for the whole army by removing all trees and vegetation between the forest and hill. Lee wouldn't let the Federals go and planned one last attack. An artillery barrage would suppress the Union guns and provide a smokescreen for the assault. Jackson was to attack Malvern Hill down the Quaker Road, while the rest of the army followed, fanning out across the line as they engaged. The exhausted and demoralized Federals would simply be overwhelmed if they didn't break. However, the Union gunners anticipated Lee and opened fire at 1300. By 1430, all Confederate batteries were out of action. The assault columns were delayed and separated from each other by muddy roads and bad navigation, and weren't ready to attack until 1530, well after the smoke cleared. The attack went forward anyway in 3 waves, but were bloodily repelled, with no unit coming closer than 200 yards of the main works. Malvern Hill wasn't a tenable position due to exposed supply lines, and McClellan ordered it abandoned, with the entire army huddling around Harrison's Landing. The Peninsula campaign was over, and with it all confidence in McClellan's abilities. In 7 days, Lee's boldness had intimidated him into defeat, inflicting 15,855 casualties at the price of 20,204. Morale soared in the Confederacy, and Lee now sought to use that boost to move north and end the war. And don't forget to check out Raid Shadow Legends with a massive selection of free stuff if you use our link in the...
Yeah, the 7 Days War kind of shows Jackson really did nothing. Don't get me wrong, he certainly had his moments, but it's the Checkmate Lincolnite series where he points out that outside of a few things, like he did nothing in this one, and that had he not been killed, he probably would have come back down to earth in terms of just, you know, the type of leader that he was. He had his moments, a lot did, but, you know, Lee certainly did a great job. McClellan was just awful. Okay, well, this is part 4. Hope you enjoyed it. Until next time, have a good day, have a good night.